Unknown planets, legendary battles, and incredible stories await you here. But don't forget to be a part of this universe. Subscribe, like, comment, be a part of this great adventure. The chamber pulsed with a cold, sterile glow. Towering glass windows framed the city of Zithara below, a sprawling expanse of silver and obsidian, its spires stretching toward the twin moons like the fingers of a deity grasping for control. It was a city built on dominance, on the weight of an empire that had never bowed, never faltered, never feared. At the heart of this dominion stood the Galactic Council, their elongated forms cloaked in ceremonial robes woven with threads of starlight. Their faces, pale and smooth as polished stone, betrayed no emotion, yet the chamber thrummed with tension. The scent of ionized energy and refined metals clung to the air, the very essence of power. And at the center of it all, High Sovereign Thrall sat rigid in his obsidian throne, his luminous, pupil-less eyes narrowed as he studied the image before him. A simple blue planet, insignificant in size, nestled on the arm of a spiraling galaxy, orbiting a single, unremarkable star. It should have been beneath his notice, a world of primitive beings who should have long since been absorbed into the grand hierarchy of the council. Yet, here it was, projected in the center of the room, commanding the undivided attention of the most powerful rulers in the known universe. Earth. A world that had defied them. They spread like an anomaly, Thrall said at last, his voice measured, yet heavy with disdain. A species that should have perished under the weight of its own violent nature. Instead, they multiply. They adapt. And, most troubling of all, they learn. The murmurs that had filled the chamber faded into uneasy silence. Thrall gestured, and the holographic display shifted, cycling through the recorded history of humanity. Wars. Countless wars. Conflicts that should have ended them, that should have reduced them to ashes. And yet, each one only sharpened them. Iron forged in fire, over and over again. He watched the flickering images, the mushroom clouds of their own making, the endless battlefields drenched in the blood of their kind, the ceaseless competition that drove them forward. They were not the first species to war among themselves, but they were the first to thrive because of it. Counselor J.Y. Venn, a veteran strategist whose mind had shaped the downfall of countless civilizations, leaned forward. His angular features remained impassive, but the analytical glint in his eyes betrayed his curiosity. They have fleets, yes, but they are scattered, uncoordinated. Their vessels are crude. Their weapons lack refinement. What possible resistance could they mount? That, Thrall said, his expression hardening, is precisely what disturbs me. A ripple of unease moved through the council. With another flick of his hand, the projection changed, showing a timeline of human advancement. Their progression was erratic, unpredictable, jagged leaps forward followed by devastating collapses. And yet, each time, they rebuilt. Stronger, faster, more ruthless. They advance without our guidance, he continued. We have neither subdued nor enlightened them, and yet they rise. Their wars forge innovation. Their conflicts fuel ingenuity. They stand outside the natural order. He let the thought settle. If left unchecked, they could surpass us. It was an absurd notion, blasphemous even, yet the evidence lay before them. The council had encountered ambitious species before, but none like this. None who clawed their way out of the dirt with such relentless ferocity. None who turned every disaster into an opportunity, who refused to kneel even when crushed beneath impossible odds. They refuse our authority, Thrall continued, his voice sharp now, his patience spent. We have offered them assimilation, and they have spat in our faces. We have allowed them the privilege of survival, and they have used it to strengthen themselves in secret. They build in the shadows, beyond our gaze. His hands curled into fists. We must end this before they become a true threat. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then J.Y. Venn nodded. A preemptive strike, then. The words should have sounded like overkill. No species had ever required a preemptive strike before. The council moved only when provoked, only when their dominance was directly challenged. And yet, for the first time in millennia, an unease had crept into their discussions. Thrall did not elaborate on the growing dread that gnawed at the edges of his mind. It was irrational, impossible, and yet, a whisper of doubt remained. The vote was cast within moments. The decision was unanimous. The Council's greatest fleet would descend upon Earth at dawn, A fleet of warships built to shatter civilizations, to raise worlds until nothing but embers remained. There would be no offer of surrender, no negotiations, no wasted words. This was not conquest. It was extermination. As the fleet left the Zitharan docks, their hulls gleaming under the cold light of the twin moons, the council watched in collective silence. There was no celebration, no pride in the decision, only the certainty of victory. It had always been this way. The council had ruled for millennia. Their power was absolute, their dominion unquestioned. And yet, no one thought to ask why the humans had never begged for mercy, why they had never sued for peace, why, despite their supposed weakness, they had never shown fear. They would soon learn. The void between the stars was silent, but silence did not mean emptiness. Beneath the black expanse, hidden in the folds of darkness where light seldom reached, something stirred. The fleet moved with calculated precision, an armada of obsidian warships slicing through the void like celestial blades. Their hulls, forged from alloys stronger than time-worn planets, bore the insignia of the Galactic Council, a sigil that had heralded the fall of countless civilizations. Each vessel pulsed with energy, charged weapons primed to reduce entire worlds to smoldering ruin. To those who watched from the cold reaches of space, they appeared as gods descending upon mortals. And yet, beneath their seamless formation, there was an undercurrent of unease. Commander Siren of the flagship Judicator stood before the bridge's vast viewport, hands clasped behind his back, eyes fixed on the distant blue world. It seemed fragile from here, almost delicate, a world unfit to challenge the Council's dominion. And yet, it had refused to kneel. It had resisted, not with force, but with silence. Something was wrong. He turned to his second-in-command, a slender being named Vereth, whose mind was as sharp as the blade she wore at her hip. No distress signals, no planetary defenses primed, no escape vessels fleeing, Siren muttered. Either they are frozen in fear, or we are missing something. Veretha's violet eyes flickered. Arrogance blinds them. They believe we will not strike. Siren considered that. Perhaps. His gaze darkened. Or they know something we do not. The Judicator led the vanguard. Behind it, hundreds of warships stood in formation, engines humming with restrained violence. The fleet moved with the weight of inevitability, their course unwavering. This was no battle. It was an execution. And yet, despite their overwhelming superiority, a thought gnawed at the edges of Siren's mind, one he dared not voice aloud. They should have seen fear by now. Fear left traces, hasty evacuations, desperate pleas for mercy, frantic attempts to bargain. Even the strongest empires, when faced with annihilation, clawed at survival. But Earth remained still, as if unaware of its impending doom. Or worse, as if it did not believe in it. Prepare orbital bombardment, Siren ordered, though his voice carried less conviction than it should have. The bridge officers responded with crisp efficiency, setting targeting coordinates with mechanical ease. Then, a flicker. A distortion in space, subtle, almost imperceptible. Siren's eyes narrowed. The instruments registered nothing, but he had spent too many cycles in war to ignore the instinct tightening in his chest. "Hold," he commanded. The officers hesitated. "Did you see that?" Vereth frowned. "See what?" It happened again, this time, a ripple just beyond their forward line. Like light bending around something unseen. A trick of the void. A glitch in their sensors? No. Siren's mind sharpened. Scanned the area. Full spectrum. The bridge fell into tense silence as the crew obeyed, their screens awash with data. The ship's sensors reached out, peeling back layers of the unseen. Then, alarms shrieked. The void split apart. From the darkness, they emerged, not scattered, not in disarray, but in formation. Hundreds. Thousands. Their shapes were unlike any known configuration, their hulls devoid of the familiar sheen of Council technology. They bore no insignia, no identifying marks of allegiance. And yet, they were unmistakable. Human. The bridge erupted in chaos. Officers barked commands, struggling to make sense of the impossible. This was not a desperate last stand. This was not a scattered militia throwing itself into a hopeless fight. This was an ambush. Siren felt something unfamiliar coil in his chest. Dread. "We are not the hunters," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "We are the prey." The first strike came before he could issue a single order. The Judicator lurched as an unseen force carved through its flank, shearing through shields that should have been impenetrable. The impact sent bodies flying, alarms wailing in protest. The fleet scrambled, but the enemy had already moved. Silent, calculated, methodical. For the first time in the history of the Galactic Council, their fleet did not descend upon an unsuspecting world. They had walked into a trap, and Earth had been waiting. The void burned. Once a place of quiet dominion, the battlefield was now a graveyard of shattered hulls and dying embers. The Galactic Council's grand fleet, once an indomitable force, had become little more than drifting wreckage. Vessels that had ruled the stars for millennia lay in ruin, their gleaming obsidian exteriors torn asunder by an enemy that should not have been capable of such devastation. Commander Siren struggled to remain upright as another blast rocked the Judicator, its reinforced hull groaning under the strain. The bridge was bathed in flickering red light, a sharp contrast to the cold blue glow that had once symbolized control, order, and superiority. Smoke curled through the air, thick with the acrid scent of burning circuitry and ozone. The walls trembled. Warning sirens wailed, their cries lost in the chaos of shouted orders and panicked responses. Siren gritted his teeth and forced his mind to cut through the noise. Panic would do nothing. Fear would serve no purpose. But facts could still be salvaged. Damage report. His voice cut through the din, sharp as a blade. A lieutenant turned, his face pale, his fingers trembling over his console. Shields are gone. Portside weapons array is inoperable. Engine capacity reduced by... He stopped, swallowing hard before finishing. 73%, Commander. Siren's jaw tightened. That was as good as dead in a battle like this. Viereth, ever composed, stood beside him, gripping the edge of a damaged console. Her violet eyes flicked to him, and in that moment, they shared the same unspoken truth. This wasn't a battle. It never had been. It was execution. And they were the condemned. They knew, she said, quieter now, but no less certain. This wasn't desperation. It wasn't improvisation. She turned her gaze toward the viewport, watching as the human fleet moved. Silent, coordinated, lethal. They laid a trap, and we walked straight into it. Siren exhaled, forcing his breath to remain steady. She was right. The humans had not been caught off guard. They had been waiting, not cowering in fear but watching, preparing, engineering this moment. "How long?" he murmured. Verth turned to him. "How long have they known we were coming?" The Council had been monitoring humanity for centuries, watching as they warred among themselves, as they built, destroyed, and rebuilt. They had always been a species in turmoil, too primitive to unify under a single banner, too volatile to be considered a true threat. Yet here they were, moving in unison, no hesitation, no division. And the most unsettling part, there had been no fear. Siren turned his gaze back to the viewport, watching the human vessels maneuver. They were unlike Council warships, lacking the rigid formations and synchronized movements that had defined their own fleets. But their apparent fluidity was not chaos. It was adaptation. They adjusted, shifting their positions faster than Council targeting systems could compensate, striking with calculated precision before fading into the black. It was not a desperate battle for survival. It was a demonstration. The Judicator shuddered again as another impact tore through its structure. Siren barely managed to steady himself. The Galactic Council did not lose wars. Their fleets did not falter. Their forces did not retreat. These were truths as fundamental as the stars themselves. And yet, "Commander," an officer's voice cut through his thoughts, "we've lost contact with over half the fleet. Survivors are scattering, those that can still maneuver." Siren closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Scattering, not regrouping. The fleet was broken. A tremor of realization crawled up his spine. This was worse than a defeat. This was humiliation. He turned to Vereth. "How did this happen? How did we not see this coming?" A long silence stretched between them before she answered. "Arrogance." The word sat heavy in the air. For centuries, the Council had viewed itself as the architect of order in the galaxy, the hand that shaped destiny. They had crushed civilizations before they could rise, had rewritten the fate of entire species without hesitation. They had believed themselves untouchable. But the humans had done something no species before them had dared. They had waited. A flash of memory, an ignored intelligence report, a young strategist's warnings dismissed in a chamber filled with those too certain of their own supremacy. Whispers of human advancements in stealth technology. Signals that had gone silent, dismissed as irrelevant anomalies. They had laughed. And now they were burning. A sharp burst of static cracked through the bridge. The comms officer, his hands shaking, stared at his screen. "Commander, incoming transmission." Siren's breath slowed. Not from their forces. Not from the scattered remains of their fleet. The humans had opened a channel. The officer hesitated. "They jammed our communications, sir. But this they're letting through." Siren met Varetha's gaze, then nodded. The channel opened, and a voice, clear and unwavering, filled the bridge. "Galactic Council Fleet, this is Admiral Elias Vance of the Terran Defense Command." A pause. "You are trespassing in restricted space." Siren felt the weight of those words settle over the bridge like a burial shroud. He had expected threats, taunts, the desperate bravado of a species clinging to the last moments before annihilation. But there was no fear in that voice. No desperation. Only certainty. The channel remained open, as if waiting for a response. Varetha's voice was barely above a whisper. "They want us to understand." Siren clenched his fists. The Council had come to annihilate Earth, to wipe humanity from existence before they could become a threat. Instead, they had stumbled into a battle already lost. He thought of Krall, still seated in the Grand Chamber of Zithara, blind to the catastrophe unfolding in the void. He thought of the centuries of doctrine, of the empire built on the premise that no species could ever challenge their supremacy. And he thought of the humans, watching as the Council's greatest fleet broke itself upon their defenses. A slow exhale. "Order the retreat," Siren said at last, the words foreign in his mouth. The bridge fell silent. The officers hesitated, disbelieving. "The Council does not retreat," one of them muttered. Siren turned to face them, and when he spoke, there was no room for argument. "We do now." The Judicator lurched violently as another blast struck its hull, but Siren no longer cared about the ship, the battle, or the Council's pride. Because he knew what this was. Not a battle. Not a war. A reckoning. And it had only just begun. The void stretched endlessly, but the Galactic Council's fleet no longer moved through it with confidence. The retreat was silent, mechanical, no discussion, no mourning, only the cold efficiency of survival. The warships that remained intact limped away from the battlefield, their hulls scorched, their formations shattered. There was no dignity in their flight. The Council had never retreated before, but now they had no choice. Commander Siren stood at the Judicator's bridge, watching the wreckage shrink behind them. Flames still licked at broken vessels, their twisted remains casting eerie shadows against the distant stars. The debris field stretched for miles, drifting husks of warships that had once been the pride of the Council's armada. He had spent his life studying war, mastering tactics, perfecting the art of domination. But nothing in his training had prepared him for this. They had walked into the abyss, expecting to cast judgment. Instead, they had met something waiting in the dark. Varetha approached, her usual composure eroded, but not entirely gone. Her face was streaked with soot, her dark eyes sharper than ever. "We lost nearly 70% of the fleet," she said. "The rest are damaged. If the humans had pursued us, we would have been wiped out." Siren exhaled slowly. "They let us go." The thought unsettled him. He had expected resistance, yes, perhaps even a brief struggle before inevitable victory. But never this. Never a force that not only outmaneuvered them but chose not to finish the slaughter. Vareth folded her arms, her gaze locked onto the vastness of space. "They didn't fight to survive. They fought to teach us something." Siren knew she was right. This was not a desperate act of self-preservation. The humans had set a trap, executed it with precision, and then let them flee. A message, not a massacre. His thoughts were interrupted by a low chime from the communication console. The officer at the station hesitated before speaking. "Commander, incoming transmission." Zithara. Silence gripped the bridge. Siren closed his eyes for a brief moment, then nodded. Patch it through. The holographic projection flickered to life, revealing High Sovereign Thrall seated upon his towering throne. The great chamber of the council was visible behind him, its ancient walls pulsing with the eerie glow of their dominion. The unreadable gaze of the sovereign locked onto Siren, but beneath his composed expression was something far more dangerous than anger. Disappointment. Commander, Thrall said, his voice smooth, measured. I trust you have an explanation. Siren straightened. His uniform was torn, his face marked by the battle, but he would not stand before the sovereign in disgrace. The humans were prepared, he stated plainly. Their technology has evolved beyond our estimates. Their fleet is, he hesitated, searching for the right word. Formidable. The council chamber remained silent. Then, HFY Ven, the strategist who had dismissed the humans as a trivial nuisance, leaned forward. His lips curled with barely contained contempt. Formidable? You speak as though they are equals. They are savages with stolen technology, nothing more. You had the greatest fleet in history, Commander. And yet, you return to us defeated. Siren did not flinch. No, Counselor. We return alive. That alone should tell you everything. A murmur passed through the chamber, a ripple of unease. Thrall steepled his fingers, his expression unreadable. You believe them a true threat? Siren held his gaze. I believe them to be beyond what we anticipated. If we act without understanding them, we will not just lose battles. We will lose everything. For the first time, something flickered in Thrall's expression, something like intrigue, or perhaps the faintest trace of worry. But HFY Ven scoffed, shaking his head. You speak like a man who has seen ghosts. They are humans, a species that could barely reach beyond their own system a few centuries ago. You are suggesting they outmatch us. Siren kept his voice even. I am suggesting they are not what we believe them to be. And that should terrify you. The silence that followed was different now. He had planted the seed of doubt. Thrall exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against the arm of his throne. Then, in a voice so quiet it barely reached the bridge, he asked, If they had the power to destroy you, why didn't they? Siren hesitated. It was the question he had been asking himself. They wanted us to return, he admitted. They wanted us to deliver a warning. A dangerous stillness filled the chamber. Then, for the first time, Thrall's voice carried an edge of curiosity. And what, Commander, do you believe the message to be? Siren exhaled, his hands tightening behind his back. We are no longer the ones who decide the fate of the stars. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then the transmission cut out. The hologram faded, leaving only the dim glow of the bridge's emergency lighting. Verth turned to him. That went well. Siren let out a dry breath, half a laugh, half exhaustion. They'll be deciding my execution before the hour is out. But Vereth only shook her head. No. You saw his face. He's afraid. Siren nodded. And he should be. Because for the first time in the Council's long reign, they were no longer the architects of fate. Humanity had risen. And now, the future belonged to them. The chamber on Zithra had never known silence, but now it clung to the air like a storm waiting to break. No whispers of power, no murmurs of control. Only the cold realization settling over the assembled counselors like the weight of a collapsing star. The Galactic Council, the architects of order, the arbiters of dominion, had been defeated. Not by a rising empire. Not by some unknown force. By humans. Thrall sat motionless upon his obsidian throne, fingers steepled beneath his chin. The recordings flickered across the massive holographic displays above them, silent testaments to a battle that should have never been lost. Ships torn apart before they could fire a second volley. Formations shattered in minutes. Entire fleets dismantled before the Council could even grasp what had happened. It was not war. It was a lesson. Across the chamber, Councillor HFY Ven's fury burned hot enough to shatter the silence. This is unacceptable. His voice echoed through the chamber, breaking like a whip against the cold walls. They should not have had the ability to. Yet they did, Thrall interrupted, his voice quiet, but laced with something sharper than steel. HFY Ven's jaw tightened. Then we strike again. We regroup, We send more ships. And accomplish what? Skrul's gaze turned toward him, unblinking. A greater loss? The annihilation of another fleet? Tell me, Counselor, how many ships will it take for you to understand what has already happened? The words struck their mark. Jeweven recoiled, but he was not alone in his belief. Others shifted uneasily, the ghosts of their lost fleet still fresh in their minds. In the center of the room, standing before the council as both a witness and a warning, was Commander Siren. His uniform was no longer the pristine emblem of the council's might. Scorch marks marred the once impeccable fabric, a deep gash along the collar where metal had nearly torn through flesh. He had been at the heart of the battle. He had seen what the others refused to admit. We underestimated them, Siren said, his voice measured, each word carrying the weight of what he had seen. Not just their strength, but their intent. Jij feinstof it. They ambushed you, Commander. That is not intent. That is desperation. No, Siren said, shaking his head. Desperation is throwing everything you have into a battle and hoping for survival. That is not what they did. He took a step forward. They let us go. Silence. Not a single counselor spoke. The statement lingered, pressing against the walls like an unseen force. Why? Skrull asked at last. It was the question that had haunted Siren from the moment his ship had turned away from the battlefield. The humans had every advantage. They could have pursued the retreating fleet, wiped them from existence. But they hadn't. They wanted us to understand, Siren said. Not just that they were strong, but that they were prepared. He exhaled. They wanted us to carry that message back here, to you. Skrull studied him for a long moment. You believe they are inviting diplomacy? Siren hesitated. I believe they are giving us a choice. A ripple of unease passed through the counselors. To be given a choice was to be placed in a position the council had never known. It was one thing to be defeated. It was another to be at the mercy of an enemy who decided whether or not they lived. Skrull's gaze flickered toward the towering screens. The recordings looped again, showing the human fleet disappearing into the void. No pursuit. No final strike. Only the quiet retreat into the darkness. Their message delivered. He had seen many wars in his time, but never this. Then tell me, Commander, Skrull said, his voice quieter now. What choice do you believe they expect us to make? Siren's throat felt dry. The answer was obvious, yet speaking it aloud would shift the foundation of the Empire itself. They expect us to realize that we are no longer the ones in control, he said, and that we have two paths before us. War. He let the word hang in the air before continuing. Or something else. Something else. Jeweven's laughter was hollow, his pride clinging to him like a fraying cloak. You expect us to kneel? Siren met his gaze, unflinching. I expect us to think. A sharp exhale from the strategist, but Siren pressed on. If we attack again, we are telling them we refuse to acknowledge what has already happened. We are telling them that we are willing to throw ourselves against the same wall until there is nothing left of us. Skrull tapped a finger against the arm of his throne. And if we do not attack? Siren's voice was steady. Then we must ask ourselves a question the Council has never had to ask before. Skrull regarded him. And that is... Siren swallowed. How do we exist in a galaxy where we are no longer the strongest? The words settled like lead in the air. For centuries, the Council had ruled through undisputed power. But power had shifted, and for the first time, they were not the ones who decided the fate of the stars. Skrull exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping against his throne's armrest. An interesting question. One we no longer have the luxury of ignoring, Viareth added, speaking for the first time. She stood beside Siren, her arms crossed, her gaze unwavering. Skrull studied them both before rising from his throne. His movement alone was enough to send a ripple through the counselors. I will not call for another attack, he said at last. Jeweven bristled. High Sovereign. Not yet. Skrull's voice was calm, but there was no room for argument. His glowing eyes settled on Siren. You have spoken of choices. Very well. Let us see if the humans are truly willing to offer them. A tension lifted from Siren's chest, though he knew this was far from over. You will return to the fleet, Skrull continued, But not to prepare for war. You will prepare for contact. For dialogue. The words were unthinkable a mere cycle ago. The Council did not negotiate. The Council dictated. But that era had ended. Siren bowed his head slightly. As you command. The chamber doors opened, and as he turned to leave, he could feel the weight of centuries shifting. The Galactic Council had spent millennia ruling through strength, reshaping civilizations at will. Now, they faced something they could not reshape. For the first time, the future was uncertain. And for the first time, they were no longer the architects of fate. Humanity had stepped from the shadows. And now, the galaxy would change forever. The void stretched infinite before the fleet, a sea of black untouched by arrogance, war, or memory. Stars flickered in the distance, indifferent to the shifting power beneath them. The Judicator, once the pride of the Galactic Council's armada, now drifted toward the unknown, not as a conqueror, but as a guest. Commander Siren stood at the bridge, hands clasped behind his back, his gaze locked on the planet growing larger on the viewport. Earth. It looked unassuming, fragile even. Blue oceans curled around vast continents, white clouds drifting lazily in its atmosphere. It did not seem like the home of a species that had just rewritten the order of the galaxy. And yet, here it was, a world that had turned an empire on its head, not through force alone, but through the undeniable power of readiness. Vereth stepped beside him, silent for a moment. She exhaled, almost amused. Strange, isn't it? Siren turned his head slightly. What? That we spent centuries watching them, certain they were beneath us. And now, here we are, waiting for them to decide if we are worth speaking to. It was strange, but it was also true. The bridge crew moved quietly, scanning, monitoring, waiting. They were no longer warriors preparing for battle. They were messengers of an empire that no longer knew its place. A chime broke the silence. "Commander," the comms officer said, fingers poised over the console. "They're hailing us." Siren didn't hesitate. "Open the channel." The holographic display flickered to life, and there he was, Admiral Elias Vance of the Terran Defense Command. His face was lined with age, his short silvered hair neatly trimmed, but his dark eyes remained sharp. He wore no elaborate regalia, no medals or adornments, only the crisp uniform of a man who needed no decoration to prove his authority. "Commander Siren," Vance said, his voice steady. "Not unkind. Not warm. Measured." "Admiral Vance," Siren acknowledged with a slight incline of his head. A pause. A long one. Then, "I imagine this is not how your people expected this to end," Vance said. Siren studied him. There was no arrogance in the statement, no mockery. Just fact. "No," Siren admitted. "It is not." Vance nodded slightly, but his expression did not change. "Your fleet came to annihilate us." Siren did not look away. "Yes." Vance leaned forward slightly. "And now?" Siren felt the weight of that question settle over him. It was not just for him. Not just for this fleet. It was for the Council. For the Empire. For the future. He exhaled. "And now we come to listen." Vance studied him for a moment longer, then leaned back. "Good," the Admiral said. Siren could not tell if it was approval or something else entirely, but it hardly mattered. The door had opened. "The Council will want terms," Siren said. "I suspect they will want assurances." Vance's brow lifted slightly. "And what about you, Commander?" Siren hesitated. It was a strange thing, being asked what he wanted. Commanders did not make history. They followed it. And yet, "I want to understand," he admitted. Another long silence. Then, to Siren's surprise, Vance smiled. It was small, barely there, but it was real. "Then you might have come to the right place." The transmission cut, and a moment later, the Judicator received its final order. "Docking clearance." The bridge remained still. Siren turned to Vereth. She arched a brow. "Well," she said, crossing her arms, "I guess we're not being vaporized." Siren exhaled a sharp breath that could have almost been a laugh. "Not yet." The ship hummed as it moved forward, drawn toward the planet, toward the unknown. For the first time in its long, ruthless history, The Galactic Council had not dictated the course of events. And for the first time, they were ready to learn. The war had never truly begun. And because of that, it had finally ended.